Hi. A couple notes up front. I had a death in the family recently, so the API that I promised in the description for this isn't done yet. I have cards. If you're interested, come get it and email me, and when it's done, I'll let you have it. So I'm one of the two co-founders of Tabula Lingua. My co-founder, Manu, is sitting right there. We work with cognitive natural language processing, and the simplest way to explain the difference between traditional NLP and what we do is that NLP is primarily concerned with the fact that words have meaning and grammar has rules. We're concerned with the state of mind of the person creating the language, either spoken or written. And one of the simplest ways that we have of looking at text is what we call blue and red. So we take all the things we can measure and we aggregate them into two values. Markdown didn't let me make that table any bigger. Blue is deliberate, red is habitual. You can also think of it as resolve and reflection, or quite simply, blue is your head, red is your heart. So we'll look at a couple of quick examples of what we can do with this. Give It to Meg is the website of a friend of mine who's a marketing writer, and with her permission, I'm using her About page as a demonstration. And so we can look at the ebb and flow of head versus heart throughout the entire document. So this highlight here stands out as both blue and red, and it says, I'm a grad school dropout who ditched analyzing crime scenes to write processes and procedures for a sprawling New York nonprofit and never looked back. When I talked to her, that transition from her plans to go to grad school and the way her family looked at her, that was like a big deal in her story of her life, that she left the traditional plan of going to grad school to become a writer. And then this is interesting. These three lines are actually one sentence, and it says, I went to oversee the day-to-day management of employee communications for the largest municipal health care system in the country and help them rebrand each of the 11 hospitals before launching my writing business. So this is also a highlight, but it shows up as predominantly blue over red. So that would mean that there's more deliberate cognitive processes going into that line. And when I talked to her about it, she said the reason that that likely happened is she spent a lot of time writing that to cover over some of the messier parts of her career and make it sound good. So in a sense, it's the effort that she put into writing and rewriting that line leaks into the language, and we can measure it. These other two we'll go through quickly. This is, I have a fascination with eventually applying what we do to things like suicide, mass violence, and addiction. And so this is something I pulled off of Reddit. It's a woman talking about her boyfriend as an alcoholic. And the main thing I want you to notice is how different the lines are and how they don't really move together that much. And you contrast that with the Facebook posts I made about my grandmother after she passed away. Even though there's some space in the lines, they're relatively moving together, and we would say that that means your head and your heart are aligned. And when they start to go up here at the bottom, I say she was caring, funny, and could be a spectacular smartass. She was a huge part of my life, and I will miss her deeply. This part here, I'm kind of going through the motions of saying the things that I think I need to say. The fact that she was a big part of my life and she's gone is the most important part to me. Here's what the data looks like. And this is from the same piece of text. For each line, we calculate the blue and red and a bunch of other numbers that we can use in different ways. And so now that you can kind of see what the algorithm does, we're going to move along to an example of how we're taking what we do and matching it up with traditional NLP. So we're doing some work for, oh, sorry.
Is there, I'm not sure I quite understand what this is, but is there like a sense of ground truth of what you're measuring against?
A sense of what?
Ground truth?
It is, I should probably tell the story of how he invented it. He was working with a friend who had a remote team, and he was looking at the emails, and the guy was complaining about certain things, and he couldn't figure out how to deal with the employees. He couldn't figure out what was going on with them. And Manu looked at the emails, and some of them, there was excuses, they were scattered, and those were the unproductive employees. The productive employees were coherent, enthusiastic, and so he wondered if a computer could measure that. So it's subjective in that he came up with the idea and the underlying model based on that curiosity, but it does what we intend it to do. And over time, we've figured out how to use it in a way that's meaningful. If you look really at, so sentiment analysis, we were just talking about this. You can take 3 different sentiment analysis algorithms and run it on the same text, they'll all come out differently. So it's not right in that there is no right. But if you spend enough time looking at language, the stuff that's highly red is flowery, it's emotional. The stuff that's highly blue is logical and analytical and deliberate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, with sentiment analysis, I think you could still have humans score sentiment also as a ground truth, noisy ground truth.
So we kind of do that, but it's not, we haven't written down exactly what we think the red should be. But we know what kind of language we want to see when red is higher than blue and blue is higher than red. Does that make sense? So if you take, I didn't do this because I used to work in politics, so I'm a dork. I usually use Donald Trump's inaugural address as, for fun. And where he is highly blue, it's like, we will do this, we will do that, we will bring back jobs, we will do this. Where he's highly red, it's like, we share one heart, one glorious destiny, or some flowery crap like that. So in that sense, it does what we want. And as we've applied it to problems, we've figured out how to use it in meaningful ways. And if you're interested, I mean, I'm trying to get through the basics of what we do to get to the rest of the talk, and doing it as best I can. So we're doing topic modeling on the Enron data set. Does everybody here know what Enron means? Anybody who does not? You? Okay. So we're doing topic modeling on the entire set of emails from Enron, which is released as a public corpus. This first one, we threw in, this is all spitballing, we threw in some labels: operations, planning, communication, trading and deals, etc. Then we took, I'm going to show you one more thing. This is the same text about my grandmother, and we can highlight certain patterns. So when red is the highest, we can do that. We can do when blue is the highest. Or the low delta, this is important. I'm sorry, I skipped it. The low delta is the most, we call it clarity. That's where the writing is most clear. When we work with online reviews, that's what we use to summarize the reviews. So what Manu did is he took the entire Enron data set and applied it only to these highlights in every email. So basically throwing out about 60–70% of the text and only focusing on the places in each email where the 2 lines are the closest, and reran the topic modeling. Does that make sense? Okay. And so some of these categories are the same, but then this last category, which he labeled random and reactive matters, came up. It is not in the first modeling, it is in the second modeling. And I asked him, had he gone back to look at the actual emails that contributed to this topic. So he sent me the IDs of each one, and I sorted by the probability that it belongs to that category, so the ones that are most a part of that category. And it's fascinating, all of these emails, and we just did this, they're all very long. So I put a separator here in between each one, and you can see that they're all pretty long. And like any email set, you have a lot of, hey, are you going to lunch, all that kind of stuff. None of that shows up in here, and we're not testing for length. So here's a flight itinerary. One of them actually has a dump of a huge, obviously Microsoft SQL query. He went in and started looking at who wrote these, and we have the whole corpus delineated by the type of employee: the executives, upper level management, the general employee, and the legal team. Among the legal team, the one guy that contributed the most to this set turned out to be the one of the eventual whistleblowers that was complaining to upper-level management about the financial practices and wound up getting them in trouble. One thing to note, the original validation that Manu did when he created this was to take the same Enron set and to run a coarse measurement across the whole thing. And this is the aggregate of that measurement from green is the general employees and white is the executives. So you can see that the employees follow a mostly quarterly pattern. This little dip right here is actually 9/11. But you also see the executives, oh crap, we're in trouble. Yeah, we're screwed. So that was how he originally validated that idea, was showing that the executives who kind of knew what was going on were thinking and communicating differently than the employees who did not. The last thing I'll show you is near and dear to my heart. I was poking around hoping to find a corpus of Donald Trump's tweets. I've always wanted to get into playing around with Twitter feeds. The look on your face is priceless. I found a website, actually. I can look it up for anybody who wants it. There's a website that actually has collected every tweet that Donald Trump has ever sent. So we're going to look at Trump tweets for fun and profit. I wrote a quick and dirty topic modeling script, and this is the topic modeling for the entire year of 2019. Then I take 1/3 of the data by the same low delta algorithm to get a different set of words. You can't really see much of a difference, but I collect the words into unique sets for each frame. And then I figure out which words are unique to each frame, which word is in the first group that's not in the second, and vice versa. So this is not entirely scientific. There's a randomizer in whatever I'm using, and every time you run it, you'll get a different set of words. However, there are always more unique words in the second set, the one using only 1/3 of the data. And only in the second set will you find things like Russia, Pelosi, Mueller. So in a sense, it's taking out a lot of the noise and allowing us to focus on the stuff where he was most involved in what he was saying. All of this is still kind of spitballing. We're not using it in production anywhere. Some of the other things we do, online reviews, the star rating is unreliable. So somebody will leave a 5-star review but have a complaint. And we have a model that's called Made My Day. It's actually 5-star reviews that have some sense of insecurity in them. That model fails if the sentiment of the review doesn't match the star rating, so we use sentiment analysis to filter those out. And that's really all I have. Does anybody have any questions?
Maybe talk a little more about what is the model.
What is the model?
Yeah, like what type of model it is, whether you use, like last year there's quite a few new NLP models coming out, whether you use any of them or...
When I say model, I don't mean like a training model. It's an intellectual model of how language and behavior, cognition are involved. It comes from, he basically looked to see when the guy had these emails that he wanted to see if he could tell the difference. Manu looked for existing software and didn't find any, but he found a whole set of linguists, the most famous of which is George Lakoff, that were studying how language comes from cognition and what it reveals about our mental state as we're communicating. And a simple way to think about it would be if you told the same story right after marrying your wife versus right after you got in a car wreck, you would speak differently. Your mental state would leak into how you communicate, and that's what we measure. And so it's a proprietary, unique intellectual model about how communication and cognition are related.
Okay.
So I'm still a bit confused about this proposal of encasing natural language processing with cognition or cognitive science. From the perspective of cognitive scientists that I am, I don't see the cognitive science part of this, and the initial distinctions that you show us about like this separation between words or concepts or phrases that are more related to things like emotion and other rationality is kind of like this credit century-old thing that nobody believes or support in the cognitive science community. So I'm still very confused about how is this connects.
So
at all
what,
with the
repeat
cognitive
what you say has been disproved?
You cannot classify speech or discourse as being rational versus being emotional. That doesn't. It may be a kind of like a folk psychology kind of way of seeing things, but it's not something that is part of the modern corpus of knowledge in cognitive science.
My response to that would be it started off as a curiosity. And like anything, like if you're going to build a light bulb and you don't know what to do when you just start trying different ideas until something begins to take shape. And that's what he did. So this does what we want it to do. And I would argue that anytime somebody says something can't be done or doesn't exist, that supposition might not be right.
Yeah, but you're claiming adding something that you're not. There's no cognitive science.
Please.
So, do you want to take that offline? Because it's not that we're classifying as emotional or rational. It's just measuring both and which one is ebbing and flowing. So it's not like this is purely emotional, this is purely rational. That is not the part that I agree that that's not possible. It's always going to be based on the subcontext. But if you look at the framing of the phrase, like I'm about to climb up a mountain, and I'm talking to you, and I'm saying, "Well, this is really hard. It's going to hurt me. It's this. It's that." I'm going to go into a state of mind where I'm more just thinking rather than doing. I climb up, love the view, and now I forget about all of it. And I'm like, hey, we should do this again next week. And I'm suddenly in a more unconscious, red language pattern. So what we're doing is measuring the shifts in state of mind, not classifying the state of mind.
If you're curious, we're happy to talk to you more about it. I understand where you're coming from.
And also dive down to the actual cognitive texts by Leonard and Adele Goldberg, and how we extrapolated rules-based information from that.
Yep, my question is, have you used this to test any of the social media from the shooters or the radicalized folks that have committed crimes recently? And obviously, do you have any plans for commercialization of any kind?
Yeah, I mean, we have clients now. We're still forming a business and growing it, so what that commercialization looks like, I'm not really sure. The one thing along those lines I've done, and I don't have it handy or I would show it to you, I'll be happy to show it to you offline, is the recent El Paso Walmart shooting, left a manifesto, and I analyzed that, and that's actually a good way of visualizing. First of all, it's creepy just to read, but when you're familiar with how these lines show up, how the data shows up in a lot of different texts, poetry, songs, Bible verses, political speeches, technical writing, the patterns look weird, and that's hard to say without showing it to you. But that's as far as we've gotten. A lot of this is just, we're building a business and we can only do so much. So we have stacks of notebooks of ideas of things we want to do. It's just the two of us. But that is something I'm very interested in. Jacob.
So you already almost answered my question by saying all of the things you tried on said all sorts of social media and technical writing. Can you expand more, if you can, if you're allowed, on where it works better or where it works worse? For example, I'm curious about scientific writing. Does it work there? Because it's supposed to be really unemotional if you actually look at it, but it's supposed to be. I don't know if it does.
The easiest explanation for that is that if the context is comparable, so if you tried to compare like social data and, technical or scientific data with poetry, they're not comparable. But emails in a company are comparable, or online reviews about a company are comparable. So we haven't tried it with scientific writing, but you're right, that would be fun to do.
I'm curious as to something that was kind of unclear to me. How do you actually classify language as being red or blue? How do you say something's more emotional or something's more logical?
That's getting into the proprietary part of it. I'll do the best I can. We classify language to underlying cognitive processes. An example would be the word victory is always a word of purpose in any context because it's about achieving something, it's about winning. So if you take just that simple idea and expand it and classify a lot of language, then when looking at text as a sequence, we have a sequence of those classifications, and the movement is what we're measuring, how it moves from one cognitive process to the other. And through a bunch of algorithmic work, that eventually gets turned into red and blue.
Okay, but is that based off of the context in which it's said? Is it based off of some sort of subtext, or are you applying a meaning to a word and saying it's invariable?
Not a meaning, a classification. Yeah, there's an underlying lookup table of words and their classifications. But again, it's all based on an original model that was created by looking at the academic works of these cognitive linguists and spitballing until it did what we intended to do.
But what is concerning is that your model isn't necessarily validated because there's no objective ground truth. You're just saying that this word belongs in this slot on the table because we often see it here. The trouble with that is words have multiple meanings and can be used in multiple contexts. You can't say that victory is necessarily always going to be something that's a red word because it's not always.
There are no red words. Red is an abstraction algorithmically very far down the path from the original classification. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so if we start with a fuzzy dictionary, like you said, if you take the whole dictionary, okay, we can take the whole dictionary in a given year, okay, and have some basic synonyms and the words have different meanings, and red and blue is further down the road, but some basic categories of sensory experience, like on the embodied cognition part of it. Are these words that relate to our sense of stability? Are these words that relate to our sense of function, sense of direction, sense of purpose? Or four other different kind of taxonomies? And then there will be overlaps that make it a fuzzy dictionary. Now, the next step in that is to actually see how the internal dialogue is looping between those categories. So once you get that, a word is not red or blue, but a particular phrase or complete thought will be more red or more blue or congruent or disparate. So we get to that point when you look at the red and blue lines, they're not based on the words, it's the language pattern and what came before it and what came after it. And those are kind of the basic precepts that the micro context is giving something more of a
I understand that, I think. So I suppose,
Framework's a little different.
yeah,
Question.
primarily I question its robustness, but the framework you've written makes sense.
Yeah, your question was coming from robustness, and robustness, it's not universal. In this one, it will be robust enough within, if you're comparing only my emails over time, most robust. You're comparing mine and my colleagues, less robust, because we're getting that noise.
Right, because you're going to have different mental states that affect language differently. It seems very difficult to me to generalize this algorithm to multiple subjects.
Yeah, so like the question the gentleman asked, like what's more useful, what's less? When it's free-flowing text written by one person, most robust. Okay? And when it is multiple people and we're imposing a artificial context that these are all Starbucks customers, it's less robust. From a practical point of view, if we want to get 50 reviews out of 500,000, it's good enough. So the robustness can be a discussion that you know the answer. It's most robust if the data going in has a commonality.
Okay.
And as that gets noisy, the robustness takes a hit. And we have to be careful about not over reading too much into it.
Right. The only other thing I have to ask is this associated with any sort of publication or any experimental report or something like that?
Very new for that. I mean, I don't have an army of grad students yet to do it.
True. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there are a lot of academic books and studies that have gone into the basis of it, not the application part.
Yeah. Is there some sort of supplementary material we can look at regarding that
Certainly.
basis? Something like that?
Certainly,
Okay.
there are YouTube videos that we can send links to about cognitive linguistics versus Chomskyan linguistics.
Yeah.
On the academic side, we find ourselves in a lonely place where the first kind of technology side of it.
Yeah. From an academic standpoint, I think
Absolutely.
it would be useful to highlight the body of work that you're pulling from and probably how you're
Absolutely.
applying it so that you can dispel any kind of concerns about the actual utility or novelty of your
Yeah,
model.
or get feedback on that, you know?
So I have a friend who's going for a PhD in some kind of psychology. I can't remember exactly what it is. And he has, one of his colleagues is a social psychologist, and she's interested in putting this through the ringer and perhaps publishing about it. But we're just at the beginning of that conversation. But I do want to show something that, I can't believe I forgot this. This is one of the simplest examples of what this is good for. We were hired to look at an email server from a company, as a Texas insurance company that went out of business very quickly. The state took over to manage the liabilities and suspected fraud. So the very first pass is us with this algorithm on that email server. The emails that we looked at in this case were from the CEO, she's a woman, and in every email we measured the delta between blue and red, line by line, and then averaged that to the document. So in a document where the lines are moving together closely, that number will be low. Where they're like this, it'll be high.
So that measures what? Variability in the document?
That's a good way to put it. Emotional is we stay away from the word emotional. When I said emotional earlier, that's really a placeholder for what is habitual subconscious thinking, which is where emotion comes from. If you're talking about somebody you care about, you don't have to put like a ton of effort into it.
If I want to give a placeholder for that, think of it as cognitive tension. Like, my head's somewhere else, but my heart's not into it.
Yeah. So we plot that variable, aggregated, I believe, to the week over the course of a year. And standard deviation leaves you with outliers. So this is when the emails, the communication style is outside of her normal range given this measurement. And then we can look into the emails that are driving the fact that it's out of range. I am the CEO, an excellent business person. I am unqualified within a regulated insurance world. In fact, I didn't remember that Tony sits on a board. So here's a CEO that thinks she's unqualified and forgets who somebody on the board is. Tony turned out later to be a friend of her husband's who was barred from practicing insurance because of previous fraud allegations. The Texas Department of Insurance plans to meet with me to chastise at a minimum over Latina and El Toro. Those turn out to be trucking companies that were insuring their shipments, going across the border where the shipments were stolen. They were filing fraudulent claims. I don't want to take a chance that the Texas Department of Insurance hears anything before the docs are in order. The company has so little value left, I want all cash and out ASAP. So again, that's where the lines are moving very closely together.
No cognitive tension about that.
Yeah.
It's fairly short months out.
Get the BMWs moved out. I just don't care any longer. So, when people ask questions about what metrics is it based on or how do we know this works, when we're able to do things like this, we consider it useful. Does it meet academic muster at this point? Not yet. We may go through that process. We may reconfigure some stuff. We may be in a better place to compare it to something that people already know that's validating.
I think it's important to go through that process. Anytime you invent something like this, which you're going to corporatize, you're going to use to make claims about anything, going through that peer review process, just like anybody would do if they invent anything else, is important because it makes your model more rigorous and therefore more applicable. I'd be concerned if you went corporate, you try to do something with this without first actually going through that process and verifying that it is indeed not only useful but benevolent.
So one thing I would say is that, we've used this in legal matters, but not as evidence. Not, oh, the red line went up, he's guilty. I mean, you don't go into a courtroom with wavy lines. But what it is good at is what are the...
We use polygraphs in courtrooms still, and that's a concern.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Just like a polygraph, it's not admissible in a court of law, but someone can be used to like, hey, let's look more into that. It's not admissible in a court of law for the exact same reasons.
Because it's not rigorous.
Because it's not rigorous, the state of mind changes, the context changes, everybody's different. Someone wasn't valued. But it's used in a framework.
Yeah, and that's what we find it useful for is things like e-discovery, when you've got a ton of documents and you just want to look at stuff that's outside the normal range given a context as a first pass. And I'm showing you red and blue. I showed that spreadsheet. We actually have a lot of different variables to play with. And so when we're working with online reviews, I don't have something I can show you, but one model again is Made My Day. And all it is 5-star reviews with a high measurement of what we call insecurity. Has nothing to do with the word insecurity. It's a aggregated number after all this math has happened. When we apply that, do what? I don't even know how to answer that.
So insecurity would be I'm writing about something but backing off. If you just scroll up to the red and blue, I would pick up the sections of the divs. So if I aggregate the divs, like high is on the right hand side, low is on the left hand side. Anytime I'm just kind of backing off, I'm like, I'm rearranging my cognition, rearranging my thoughts. That would be a placeholder for what we're using as insecurity.
And so when we applied that model to 5-star reviews, which sounds like a juxtaposition, the reviews that come out are usually very gracious, and they almost always mention somebody's name. My car broke down, but Tom took care of me. And about half of them have somebody's name where they're pointing out this person really made this a pleasurable experience, and it's usually because there is some sort of tension going into the engagement. And so when we've run that model on reviews from different companies in different industries, the same thing happens. So is that, academically solid? No, but we have found it to be useful enough to try to build a business around it. And we actually do have some paying clients. But I agree with you. I mean, I would eventually like to go deep into all that. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? I kind of understand this is not open source, but I see in your abstract say you will have an API open to the public. Can I ask for that API?
Yeah, as I mentioned, my grandmother recently passed away, so I simply haven't been able to finish it.
Okay.
I've done a bunch of refactoring to the algorithm itself, which is just a Python package, and then I deploy it in Flask APIs. I haven't had a chance to. If you want my business card, I'll be happy to send it to you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Why not employ machine learning in this model? Because then you could mistrain the model and get effectively whatever result you want. And it would make it very easy to explain away the gaps in the explainability. Because we know machine learning models have a very poor explainability story. And so then that way, I think it would be a lot easier to sell the model.
Yeah, we on our future roadmap, we have. I've been talking about this for years about seeing if we can use what we do as unique features for machine learning, or to see if what can machine learning tell us about it that we can't see in what we do.
But I believe you're talking about using some tools in machine learning to add more rigor to this.
Well, actually the opposite. Because the machine learning model is very difficult to interpret, then the questions you got around the lack of rigor of the model could be explained away by saying, oh, this is the machine learning model, and we understand that it's difficult.
Can I ask, are you proposing that they use something to make it easier to get away with giving something back?
I'm just suggesting how to maybe improve the ability to sell the model.
Yeah. Why though? Why? That seems like a pretty irresponsible question.
I suspect the question is why try and sell a model that is non-rigorous and non-validated?
Yeah.
Would that be a responsible enough?
So why then would you make it easier to sell that model by making it easier to restore that lack of rigor instead of increasing the rigor of the model?
That's a deep question. A lot of people in the machine learning industry should ask themselves.
Yeah. So.
I heard the question as an idea towards using something that I haven't considered. How to solve the fundamental issue of proving the rigor. Is it groupthink? Is it like at some level we're pushing the subjectivity further and further and away, right? So if 50,000 people agree, now is it objective enough, you know? So that might be a quick way to gather data in other circumstances. I can't read his mind or speak for him, but it's something worth exploring for me.
Anybody have any more questions? Like I said, if you want a business card and are interested in the API, I'm happy to share that with you when it's done. Thank you.